one particular IRA man, I arrested him 3 times. I arrested him when I was a constable, a sergeant, and an inspector. And I remember him and my 2 kids, and made a day off, went to the seaside. And as we pulled into the car park, this guy pulls in behind me, and he gets out with a few heavies. 1981 was the year of the hunger strike, the Bobby Sands' death. I think I'm right in saying it was 1:17 a.m. on the 5th of May. That whole period, 1981, I spent in the back of Land Rovers, knee deep in fish and chip papers and empty cases of plastic baton rounds. And the special branch got information that I was going to be taken out. I was whisked out and had to live in a police station undercover for 9 months.
Stephen, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate you coming to take the time. Second RUC officer I've spoken to. I spoke to Colin Breen before. Great interview. Very, very nice man. You might give us an idea of like where it was that you grew up, what the area was like. You grew up like kind of pre-troubles, and then sure. And into the conflict too, you know.
Yeah. Well, my full name is William Charles Stephen White, and the William will give some of your listeners some idea of the background, and the Charles Stevens comes from my grandfather on my mother's side, who was Charlie Stevens, and before partition, he was a riveter working on the ships in Belfast, including the Titanic. So I have his Riveters Union card from 1907. So it's not that far back in my life or my generation that there were those who had influenced me as a child who remember Ireland as part of the British Empire or pre-partition or whatever way you wish to describe it. So my family would be from a unionist, pro-service, military and other organizations, but mostly industrial working class people who had moved into Belfast during the Industrial Revolution and lived on one side of the river, the Lagan, the side where the shipbuilding is, which was predominantly Protestant, as opposed to the other side, which is predominantly dockers and Catholic nationalists. So sadly, even the river divided my family. And I'm talking about only 2 generations before me. When I came out of my grandmother's house as a little boy, age 4 or 5, there was the murals. So I'm talking about the late 1950s, King William of Orange painted in 15-foot paintings across the street. So my family came from an orange background, something which I rejected, which we can come about later. But I am definitely from that Protestant unionist, pro-service type of upbringing. I was actually brought up in a very religious family, very evangelical, Baptist. And the interesting story about that is my father was a tough street fighting guy who forged his age, fought the Japanese in World War II, came back tattooed, plenty of experience, and then falls in love with my mother, who's the youngest of the family. He was the oldest of his family, the tough guy. She was the spoiled little girl, but very religious and proper, and basically said, if you want to be with me, you're going to have to start getting involved with the church. So he stopped drink. There was no alcohol in my house when we grew up. The biggest thrill was on FA Cup final day when my dad was allowed a bottle of cider and I was allowed to sip from the cap. So I'm not saying we were puritanical, but it was that sort of Protestant, evangelical, literally biblical following type of upbringing that I was in. Now, that was me. I'm talking about up until maybe 11 or 12. And then, like most young guys, you rebel against all that. But that gives you some flavor of my upbringing. Very much working class, Protestant, shipyard workers who had served in World War I, World War II.
Remind me, what year were you born?
I was born 1954, which is really only 9 years after the end of World War II. And an interesting fact, which I only found out later, I buried an old uncle recently, and he told me that again, my father was William Samuel. I'm William Charles Stephen. My son's William Peter. It's just a throwback from way back to Williamite days, I suppose. But he told me that his big brother, my dad, didn't return from World War II until 1948. you tend to think that, you know, the war ended in 1945, everybody came back home, but he was actually policing the peace. So he would have still been on the aircraft carriers, mopping up any Japanese or preparing for any retaliation or sort of rekindling of the war. So when you think about it, the trouble started in 1968, or what we call the current troubles. So some of those men and women who'd served in World War II as teenagers, they were still only in their late 30s, early 40s when they were either in the British Army or had joined the police or were recalled into reservists. So, you know, the older I get, and I'm an old man, I was 69 years old yesterday. You know, so the older I get, the more I realize time really is compressed. When I look at World War I and see all those black and white photographs and so on, it's another world. But I guess men that I served along with, military and police, some of them actually had World War II service. In the same way that my son and my grandson think of, you know, I served in a different planet when there were the troubles and people were killing each other and policemen were being killed and all sorts of mayhem was going on in Northern Ireland. They see that almost in black and white, so to speak.
First of all, happy birthday anyway. I didn't know that. And okay, so yeah, actually, like I said, I interviewed Billy Hutchinson a couple hours ago, and he was born in 1955. So yeah. He was like you, kind of like mid-teens when the troubles began officially, but obviously there was a big heating up and simmering before that. So yeah. When you were in like your coming into your teen years and stuff, like do you remember what your thoughts were on the conflict going on? If I had asked you to explain at the time, like Stephen, yeah. what's happening? Why are these people fighting? Do you know what you'd have told me?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of those prejudices that exist today and certainly existed in the past that sadly stereotypes people. You know, I know there are people who think that anyone who served in the Royal Ulster Constabulary is a demon. You know, that we are less than human. And we are legitimate targets, to use that terribly obscene label that we had. Likewise, I'm old enough to remember a period when Catholics, whether they were nationalist, Republican, or no political views, were seen, because we never knew any. None lived in my area. We didn't go to school with them, didn't play sport with them. So they were seen as the other. And there was always this concern that, you know, they didn't agree with partition, so they're anti-British, they're anti-states. There's always that sort of suspicion. But the reality is, you never met anybody. I had only one Catholic friend, and I'll tell you about that story in a minute. But you know, I suspect that it's the same old thing. There's them and us. So if I'd been brought up as a young Catholic nationalist stroke Republican, I would have probably hated the police, whether I'd even met a police officer or not. And in the same way, I know that in my family, because some of my family were in the Orange Order, there was this feeling that, you know, Catholicism, Roman Catholicism was wrong, and Roman Catholicism equaled nationalism, which is anti-British, and we are British, and we have served the crown, and we have fought the war. And so there was all that sort of horrible stuff. And yet at the same time, we were crossing the border, camping in Bray, going to, you know, my father loved going down south for holidays, even though he was in the heart of a Protestant East Belfast working class area. But I had an idyllic childhood. I grew up in a period where it was safe to walk the streets, literally to walk to school, even when you were 6 or 7 years old, to get a bus into town. You know, I'm sure there were pedophiles and all sorts of things around at the time, but there was no publicity, there was no concerns, there was no fear. And as a child, I mean, I joined the Cubs, joined the Scouts, became a Scout leader, carried a sheath knife, played for football teams in East Belfast, all hard guys, you know. And in a sense, I had a great upbringing. But I suppose what picked me out a little bit from the, I was the first child ever in my family, both families, my dad's and my mum's, to pass the 11 plus and go to grammar school. I was the first person ever to go to university. You know, my mother and father had to leave school at 14. They lived in a house with an outside toilet. I didn't see a shower until I was, you know, probably 10 or 11 years old. You washed in the sink or a tin bath. That sounds like otherworldly. But as I said, I am an old man, but I actually think I had a tremendous upbringing. But then reality kicked in. So if I was born in 54, I was about 13, 14 when things started to take a bad turn. And there's a local football team up here called Glentoran, very much associated with East Belfast. Their football ground is literally within the shadow of the shipyard cranes. Myself and a lot of guys, we'd have followed them home and away. We were footballers ourselves, soccer players. And one Catholic who lived in a Protestant area had joined the local church Cubs and Scouts with me, was football mad, a chap called Dennis O'Flaherty. I'll never forget him, because every time I get a chance, I talk about him. And he was just one of us until, if you recall, or certainly Billy Hutchison would recall, well, about 1969, these local defence organisations started to spring up before the Ulster Defense Association. So we had the Woodville Defence Association, you had Woodstock Tartan, you had the Young Newton, all these gangs of young men who were being mobilised and eventually would become paramilitaries. But they were just tough guys who were protecting their area, as they saw it, literally a defence association against Catholic nationalist Republican violence, in the same way that the IRA grew from, I mean, the modern provost grew from the tax that Protestants were doing on the Catholic housing areas. So we were at a youth club one night, and this guy Dennis would have been about 15. He was going with a girl about 13 called Rosie, and in comes the youth club, about 6 or 7 guys in what was the standard uniform in those days: Wrangler denim jacket, Wrangler denim jeans, Doc Marten boots or steel toe cap boots, and they kicked the bejeebers out of him because he was a Catholic. And then the girls kicked the bejeebers out of the girl because she was going with a Catholic boy. And I froze, and I wasn't the shrinking violet, but I just couldn't do anything. And to my shame, to this day, I'm still ashamed of myself that I didn't take a kicking with him to protect him. It was just the sheer fear of these numbers, these guys coming in. And I have no doubt that was one of the seminal moments in my life which made me think, I'm going to have to do something about this, which is why I did join the police and why I became involved in both putting away nationalists and loyalists. So, I mean, to me, if they were criminals, they were criminals. But certainly my upbringing was pro-British, unionist, loyalist. But my belief is, and always will be, once you put the uniform on, you're neither affiliated to one or the other, whatever people try to label you as.
Then, and I guess now, could you understand the argument behind the wanting the 6 counties to rejoin the 32? Like could you see that as being a reasonable, like a reasonable thing that Irish people think they're entitled to? Absolutely
now. Of course, as a 12, 13, 14-year-old boy, sort of brainwashed into thinking, Armageddon's coming, and the IRA are coming over the hill, and all the Protestants are going to be slaughtered, and we're the minority in Ireland, despite being the majority. And all, your head's filled with that nonsense, and it is nonsense, because as my dad and others would say, we all, if it only realised, we were all suffering, all the working class people. Labour and socialism really didn't get a look in. It was divided on orange and green. But as has often been said, the working class Protestants and the working class Catholic, they've so much more in common. Now, the fact that one preferred the British state and what it represented and all its traditions, going back kings and queens to William the Conqueror, wherever you want to start the ball rolling, to others who were looking at it from a more Irish, the chieftains and all the tribes and all the Irish history, which I was never taught. I mean, that's the sad thing. Yeah, I went to a British Protestant school. We were taught English history. You weren't taught Irish history. But the older I get, and certainly as a police officer, once you start going through that sort of indoctrination of realizing, a lawbreaker is a lawbreaker. A good guy's a good guy and a bad guy's a bad guy. And, we're trying to do our best, as usual, stuck in the middle. The idea of having a united Ireland doesn't give me a problem at all. What does give me a problem is violence, trying to achieve an objective by violence, either keeping Catholics down or preventing nationalists having a united Ireland or trying to get a Brits out. You know, all that nonsense, really. When you think about it, the Scottish nationalists had a referendum, not one bullet fired. You know, so to me, and I know there's been talk, Michelle O'Neill and others have been quoted as saying there was no alternative. Catholics and nationalists felt there was no alternative but to take on the state and to kill British soldiers or to do the bombing campaign or whatever. I actually think that's a nonsense. If there'd been better leadership on both sides, who'd said, look, this is a divided society. We've got to do something to make things more balanced. And I know there were some attempts, you know, whether it be Sunningdale or wherever in the 70s. But I, despite all my upbringing and the fact that I proudly consider myself as a British police officer and part of the British establishment, and I've been awarded and given various honours and titles and so on to do with the British state, I'm a proud Irishman. If there was United Ireland tomorrow and it was the majority desire, I wouldn't have a difficulty at all. I know some people would rather die than be part of our. Not at all. I'm actually very proud. In fact, no matter where I am in the world, I usually introduce myself first and foremost as an Irishman or a Northern Irishman, and you know, I'm certainly not English, and you know that is one of the defining moments of my life. I remember as a young superintendent, I was staffing the chief constable at the time, Sir Hugh Annesley, and Ireland were playing rugby against England, and he said, "Why do you support Ireland when most of them are from the Republic?" I said, "Well, I know what I'm not. I'm not English, so of course I'm going to support Ireland. You know, okay, it's a mixed team, and I think that sets an example for how perhaps other sports and life should go. But yeah, I honestly think it's absolutely legitimate that people want this island and this country reunified, and if it was done peacefully and democratically, and obviously there's a whole plan required in terms of the economics and so on, and what would law enforcement look like? Obviously, that's a big interest to me. But just look what's happening at the minute. Half of the senior team in the Garda Síochána were trained in the RUC. You know, the colleagues of mine. And we have cross-fertilization. People who have served in the Guards are working up in the north. So, you know, all these things can be resolved without major trauma.
That's interesting. Okay, you're saying the argument behind it and the wanting it is perfectly legitimate, but the legitimacy of it stops when violence comes in. Would you apply the same logic to, we'll say, like the IRA of the 1910s, 1920s, like the Michael Collins and De Valeros? Were they like acting immorally or acting wrong by bringing violence into it?
It's difficult for me because everything has to be contextualized, and I prefer to talk about experience. Yes, we learn lessons from history, and the old saying about if we don't learn, we repeat history and so on. One of the things that does concern me is that, you know, the pro-treaty and anti-treaty, the fact that people turned on themselves, comrades turned on themselves, and you see that a lot even in today's Northern Ireland. We have had the IRA, for example, in so many manifestations, and the INLA, and you know, and I remember having this debate in New York. I was part of a project where people were taken away to safe areas. So we went to New York, we went to San Diego, or we went to Atlanta in Georgia, people who were police officers, people who were former terrorists, ex-prisoners and so on. And we were given the opportunity to talk to each other. And I remember one guy, there were all these different exercises facilitated and enabled by clever men than me. And there was one of the ones was the empty chair. You know, you could put someone in the empty chair and tell them what the issue was. It was almost like psychotherapy. Or you could place someone who was with you in the chair. And I remember this guy, this INLA man, putting me in the chair and saying, you know, Steve, you and I we're just the same. You know, we're just products of where we were brought up. And, you know, we were just combatants. We were just doing our duty. I said, how dare you? Don't ever try to put me in the same box as yourself. You guys killed each other. Never mind what other atrocities, you know. So there is some issue. So that's both moralistic, I suppose, and looking at it from a criminal point of view. An organization that is prepared to kill, torture, and abduct and destroy families of their so-called comrades, that gives me a problem. That's maybe not answering your question in full, but what I'm simply saying is, yes, people may well have good intentions. People may well form up organizations and bring an end or bring a success to what they've tried to do, either, an independent Ireland or the partition or the 26 and the 32 and all that. But even what went on afterwards indicated to me that, there was no final solution. There was no perfect ending. So maybe that's not a very articulate way of answering it, but I do have issues around people forcing their way or getting their way through strength and murder and mayhem, as opposed to negotiated settlement. And there's plenty of examples in the world at the minute where, it's happening again.
Fair enough. No, I understand. Okay, so before you joined the RUC, you spent some time in the UDR, which, for anyone who doesn't know, was I think at the time was the biggest, I don't know if the word's battalion or regiment.
Biggest regiment, yeah.
Right, but biggest regiment in the British
Yeah.
Army. Yeah, you might tell us about like when you joined,
Yeah.
how long you spent in there, etc.
I was just a typical lad. 16, I met the woman who was to become my wife. Sadly, that marriage didn't last, but that just to say, like a lot of boys in the 70s, if you weren't going with a girl, you weren't getting engaged by the time you were 18 or 19, there's something wrong with you, So I know times have changed rapidly, but in my day, a lot of guys, you met your girl, your future wife at school, you had the same circle of mates playing football and so on. What changed for me with, I suppose, was I was fortunate to go to university. I was fortunate to work in industry, and my life was simply around my girlfriend, football, and motorbikes. I still ride motorbikes. So to me, I had an idyllic lifestyle. My father was a cop, and he was a former B special. So again, for me, those were norms. So the sight, the smell of his wet uniform hanging in the cloakroom, the sight of a gun strapped to his waistband, big deal. That's just like somebody coming home from work with a saw and a hammer, if their dad was a joiner. So all those things were normal until 69, 70, when my dad was being sent up to Derry. He was a motorbike cop. He rode the motorbike around Strandtown, a very leafy suburb part of Belfast, not too violent. Suddenly he was coming home, and I could hear him talking about his friends who'd been injured or mutilated by petrol bombs, burning their faces and stuff, So it started to get a bit more personal. But still, my life carried on. That was my dad's job. I left school at 18. Again, that working class ethic, university, you've got the grades and all that, but, you're a white, you're one of us, get out there and earn some money. So it's what I did. So I was picked up by Glaxo, the big pharmaceutical company, as a trainee manager, and did things like 3 months on the shop floor, 3 months with the salesman, 3 months with the accountants, marketing team, all that sort of stuff. And while I was on the shop floor, this guy came up to me and said, "What age are you?" And I think I was 18 at the time, just about to turn 19. And he said, "Have you ever thought of joining the UDR?" Well, I thought he meant the UDA, which, as far as I was concerned, were the scum of the earth. These were the guys that had beaten up my Catholic mate. And he said, the UDR is part of the British Army. And something clicked in me that, this might give me the chance to do something to, in a sense, address what I saw as bullying. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's how I saw terrorism, bullying. My mother had got caught in the Bloody Friday bombs. She had been shard with glass walking past Oxford Street when those 5 people were killed. I knew my dad had been shot at. I knew his friends had been hurt in the Troubles. It still seemed distant to me, but suddenly when this guy said, "Why don't you do this?" I did a little bit of research. Obviously, this was 1974. The UDR had been established in 1970. it was part of the Hunt report to try to do away with what was the B specials and seen as a Protestant force within a Protestant police department, this Protestant reserve, this special constabulary. But as I say, because my dad was one, I just assumed they were good guys. So, but I joined the Ulster Defense Regiment. Now, before I come to that, let me just say one thing. When I was growing up, I was 15 and I was beaten up by the police. Like all young lads, I have a less than perfect teenage. And this sounds horrible, but people would go to watch riots. And I'm sure if you speak to any young Catholic, any young Protestant lad from working class area, they'll tell you there's those who are in the front line throwing the petrol bombs or trying to attack the other side. Most people are going down to watch because it's exhilarating. It's something that's happening, you know, and I hate that term recreational rioting, but in those days, Catholics were burning out Protestants. Protestants were burning out Catholics. It was literally a couple of 100 yards away from where I lived. I lived in the Hollywood Road, which is off the Newton Ards Road, where the Provos were born. The Battle of St. Matthews, I think it was either 1970 or 71, when Catholics were being attacked by Protestants. Then the gunmen of the Stickies, the official IRA, were being accused of not defending Catholics. Some guys climb up into the church in St. Matthews, a Catholic church, and shoot people. I think 3 Protestants were killed in one night. And again, only last year, as I was burying an old uncle, he told me that one of his mates was Ginger, was his nickname, was one of those people that was shot. So that's how local Northern Ireland is. Everybody knows something about something, you know. And so there's an uncle of mine loses a friend on the night that I'm down watching rioting. The British Army, of course, were on the streets, and they baton charged and the young Protestants who were attacking the Catholics. To me, it was like a fisticuffs, only worse. You know, we're throwing stones at each other, throwing petrol bombs. I'm not making myself out to be a goody-goody, but I didn't do anything other than watch. I just thought this was exhilarating is the best term I could, you know, it was like almost observing something, like Napoleonic Wars, 2 sides fighting each other, you know. And me and my mates, we were all more interested in football, but we're watching it anyway. To cut a long story short, baton charge happens. I'm chased and start running with everybody else up an alleyway. Someone kicks the backyard open in a house, in a terraced house, and everybody's running through the house. So if you can imagine, there's a man and his wife sitting watching TV, and all these young kids are running through the back door and through the front door. And the cops come in. Cops come in the front door. Cops close the backyard. About 30 of us are caught like trapped rats. And my immediate thought is, I am in trouble. My dad's a cop. He will kill me if I have let down the family name. My mother, God love her, this religious woman, will be so disappointed that her son was anywhere near the trouble. My schoolmasters will be so disappointed I'll not get finishing my O-levels, and I'll be going to jail, because I knew people like I knew were going to jail, people I knew had been interned. So somebody pushed me forward, and this sergeant gave me a cracker of a rabbit punch, and I lost my breath. And of course he said, "What are you doing here?" And no uncertain time. I said, "I'm visiting my granny," because my grandmother literally lived on the other side of the road. And he said, "Yeah, sure you are." And then he grabbed me by the scruff of the neck and the arse of my trousers, threw me out in the alleyway, and I realized I was going to be let free. And the relief. And then I looked up, and of course, there's a whole row of cops who give me what I deserved, I suppose, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And one of my mates, I think it is, his nose broken, and I got a bit of a hiding. But the two of us laughed about it afterwards. I remember going back and thinking, at least I'm not as bad as you, or you know. And my only fear was if my dad finds out, because some of those cops would probably have worked with my father. Now, the reason why I tell that story, and the reason why it's so vivid in my brain, I come from a police family. All that proved to me is I was a bad boy. I was a stupid boy. I deserved everything I got because the cops are the heroes. If I'd been a young Republican Catholic, that proves it. All those police officers are horrible, vindictive, anti-Catholic thugs. But I can't explain it any better than that. It was ingrained in me that law and order, British Crown forces, are right. So when this guy says to me, do you want to join? And I suddenly realized, actually, I could be one of those guys. I jumped at the chance, and I did my basic training. And within 6 weeks, the major called me into his office and said, White, you have A levels. We're looking for officers. Would you take a commission and go to Sandhurst, which is the military training academy? I had no idea what a commission was. I'd never heard of Sandhurst. And I said, no, thank you, sir. I'm more than happy to be a private soldier. So I sat in the Land Rover, and it's probably the best decision I've ever made in my life. I sat in Land Rovers with men who had been evacuated from Dunkirk, who had fought in Korea, who had been in the Battle of Arnhem. You know, my staff sergeant had been shot and wounded in Dunkirk. This was 1974. So if you think about it, he had probably been 18 or 19. He was now an old man. You know, in my view, a really old man. He'd have been about 50. And the war stories they told, the life experiences they had, and lo and behold, they all loved me because I was this young kid. So I became a lance corporal and a corporal and a platoon sergeant. So I ended up leading all these people who were maybe twice or maybe nearly 3 years, 3 times my age. I played football for the regiment. We ran the British Army orienteering team and won the championship. I did Nijmegen walk. First time I've ever been out of Northern Ireland. They sent me to Holland to take part in sport. So I had the experiences of a British soldier, both in terms of sports and patrolling the streets of Belfast. I left the company I was with to go to university because the Glaxo at that time had like 2 streams of trainee managers. If you were a young graduate, slightly higher salary and faster promotion. In my case, I had A levels, 18-year-old, less life experience, slightly less salary, and the path was a little bit slower. So I left the company, went to university, read economics and business studies with the intent to come back, but I enjoyed my life as a part-time soldier so much. I never went to a lecture before lunchtime. I was always on patrol in Belfast. Summers I went full-time and learned everything from jumping in and out of helicopters. I became an army marksman in terms of shooting. I had a fantastic sporting career as well as being a patrol platoon sergeant. So the time I joined the police then at 23, I graduated from Queen's University, but within a few days was in the police training depot. I was already, in my view, a man, an experienced man. I was 23. The average age of a recruit then was 18 and a half. So I was the old guy. I was the old guy with medals on my chest. I'd been a British soldier, albeit part-time, albeit the Ulster Defense Regiment. But I thank God for that, because if I joined the RUC at 18 or hadn't been in the UDR and learned how to handle myself and manage men, and that's, you know, I'm a great believer in leadership by example, visible leadership, all those sort of things. I did my apprenticeship in the same way my dad learned to be a joiner or a fitter in the shipyard. I learned to be, I hope, some sort of a leader of men, literally on the shop floor, in this case, in the back of Army Land Rovers and then helicopters and so on, before I became an officer.
Sorry, if I could take it back to your UDR, was there any instances where you actually clashed with some paramilitary, be it Republicans or Loyalists?
Only Loyalists, I'd have to say, because we were based in a Loyalist area in East Belfast. Yes, on border patrols, I would have volunteered for everything, you know, because I was young. And then a few other young guys joined. So there was a little cadre of us, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, fit as a fiddle, always winning assault course or football or tug of war, or whatever it was. We were the sportsmen, but we also had to prove ourselves. So if they needed anybody to volunteer for anything, be dropped off in the border to crawl across a field and spend the night watching some IRA quartermaster's house and logging any cars that were going in and out. I mean, I did all that, but that was always covert. There was no there's no interaction. There's certainly no gunfire or battles of that sort. But the UDR was kept out of all that public order interaction, you know. So at that time they were seen as being either not trusted or not trained enough. and the RUC would take the lead in public order. But I do remember being asked to, excuse me, to get involved in searches of loyalist pubs in areas where it was expected that there'd be weapons hidden. And for some of the UDR men who lived in those particular areas, it was quite nerve-wracking because, you know, everybody identified you. I lived in a relatively safe part of Belfast. I mean, you're still only talking about a mile away, but a mile in Belfast can be a long distance as opposed to living 100 yards away from a street where you're patrolling.
Right. There was it's known and it was encouraged by like a lot of UVF leaders and so on. They would encourage their men to join the UDR because you're not going to get better training really than British Army training. I mean, most notably Robin Jackson, who I'm sure anyone who's familiar with the Troubles would know was a dual member. Was there any? Did you come across anything like that in your time? Anyone in also in a loyalist paramilitary group, or maybe later going to them after getting UDR training?
No, I'm not going to deny that it happened, but it didn't happen in my platoon. It didn't happen in my company, and I think that was because we had fantastic supervisors. As I say, we had leaders, we had men who had literally fought in World War II and in other conflicts, Korea, Aden, Palestine, so on. And we were run like a military outfit, and we were good sportsmen as well. And I'm not being too sort of, I don't want to paint the picture we were all perfect at anything, but what we did have was the vast majority were Protestants. Substantial number were in the Orange Order. Some other platoons and some other bodies within the UDR that I came across, you could see there was a sectarianism. There was a deep-seated hatred of all things Catholic and nationalist. But I can honestly say I've never heard of anybody from my particular company or battalion. That was the battalion that covered the Hollywood and East Belfast area, getting involved in anything. But it would not surprise me that the organization was or could be infiltrated, because, as you say, what better way to get training? What better way to be given the names, addresses, and photographs of IRA suspects? And at that time, there's a very different atmosphere in 1974 than what there is in, say, 1994. You know, 1974, it was almost like dog eat dog. You know, this is civil war. This is either going to go one way or the other. You know, we're fighting for survival. And I really hated the paramilitaries, even within my own area. I mean, I had to drive through. I say I always rode motorbikes, so I'd be stopped on my motorbike even going on duty to the UDR by UDA thugs, you know, standing there with their batons and so on. And then, of course, once they recognised me, who I was or whatever, you'd be waved through. But woe betide some poor Catholic trying to get through a barricade. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes you forget just how bad it was. You know, 1972 was, I think, the worst year, but all those years in the 70s, I mean, I remember I left school in 1973. There were 3 IRA men blew themselves up. We heard the bomb going off when we were sitting in class. And I remember going up to look at what was left of the vehicle. It was a car bomb. It had exploded prematurely, and there's bits of bodies lying about. You know, it's macabre. It was like living in Beirut or somewhere at those time. You know, it was. I think people forget just how violent Belfast was, and I'm talking about Belfast, but obviously other parts of the country as well.
Right, of course. Okay, what year? What year was it? What age were you joining the RUC? Sorry, you said you were 23. What year was that? You joined?
I joined the RUC in 1978.
Very good. Okay, so you came in already having probably like arguably a better standard of training than most in it. You did your training. How long then before you were like out in the street? Did you start off on patrol?
Yeah, like everyone in the police, and that's one of its great strengths, I believe. Whether you're a future chief constable or whatever, you know, we all start at the at ground level. I left the training centre and went to my first police station in November 1978. And I do a lot of talking about leadership and the importance of role models. And I was very fortunate. I had 2 sergeants, one for about a year and a half, who was tremendous, ran a really tight ship. There was no nonsense went on, no drinking on duty, no over-violent approach to prisoners or whatever. And then he was replaced by another guy who was probably an alcoholic, lazy, and all the things that you don't want, who both of them saw something in me. The first guy basically expected me to do well and would give me lots of responsibilities and give me a hard time if I didn't shape up. The other guy saw me as a good excuse for him to delegate. And, so, a lot of people know me as Stevie. Stevie White is how I've known in sort of police circles. Said, Stevie boy, you're going to go places to help you. Instead of me checking all the other constables' work, you do it. So a night shift from about 2 o'clock in the morning, I was reading all the other guys' files. So if I was only dealing with, say, 10 drunken driving, assault on police, theft, I was reading the other 20 guys' files as well. So I was learning about sexual assaults and other offences that I hadn't personally arrested people for. It was a fantastic training, which meant within 2 years, you're allowed to sit the sergeant exam. I came in the top 3 or top 4 of the sergeant exam, which brought me under national notice. So I was then sent over to England for 3 days of home office testing in relation to psychological aspects, intellect, and so on, and then was put in what was called the fast stream, the accelerated promotion. So within a very short time, I was moving up the ranks. The one thing that I remember was that 1981 was the year of the hunger strike, the Bobby Sands' death. I think I'm right in saying it was 1:17 a.m. on the 5th of May. And like a lot of young cops, because I was fit and could handle myself, we were put into units that were mobile units, mobile support units. And I was up in Londonderry, Derry on the night it happened. And when Bobby Sands died, we were turfed out on the streets. But within a day or two, there was rioting everywhere going on in Belfast. And I was stationed in Dunmurry, which covered an area at that time, which included Twinbrook and had the DeLorean factory. So you had John DeLorean and his famous gull-wing car being built, and the factory was being attacked. So we were sent down to protect the factory, which, if my memory's right, there was about £250,000 worth of damage done to it. And this was one of the jewels in the crown of the British economy, how they'd got this American investment coming in to help Belfast in one of its deprived areas. And it was the first time I was shot at. So this IRA sniper took a few pot shots at myself and a few other guys. And another guy who, like me, had some military training, we tried to return fire. Neither of us pulled the trigger because we couldn't see exactly where he was shooting from. I think it was from a house, the roof of a house. But there were people in between us, so we couldn't fire. And that's one of the differences, in my opinion. We try to minimize casualties. And that whole period, 1981, I spent in the back of Land Rovers, knee deep in fish and chip papers and empty cases of plastic battering rounds, and it was a pretty militarized situation. And yet, here's the thing: we were still expected to be ordinary cops. So one day, in the middle of all this, the sergeant says to me, "White, tomorrow don't come in to work with unit. You don't need your shield, your batting gun, and all that stuff. Have your best uniform on. You're going to the local primary school to take kids through their cycling proficiency test." So, you'd been watching your mates getting hammered. You're literally dealing with death and destruction. And then you turn up the next day and take kids through what was the Tough Day Club, or, how to cross the road, or how to ride a bicycle. And I think that was one of the great strengths of the RUC. Now, I lecture on this subject about you should never make a police officer a soldier, and you should never try to turn a soldier into a police officer. You're either one or the other. One fights to kill, the other one serves to preserve the peace, etc., etc. But in Northern Ireland, we used to proudly say that the RUC was special. And a lot of us still believe it, by the way. We were given a very special, certainly a very extraordinary task. We were asked to behave almost like infantry, and yet at the same time be public servants and good police officers, and help little women across the road and look for lost dogs, and do that diligently and give it the same attention. Now, a lot of guys couldn't. You know, if you look at the suicide figures within the RUC, 20 killed themselves between 72 and 82, 20 more between 82 and 87. So the rate doubled, 20 in 10 years, 20 in 5 years. I did a bit of work on that, and spent some time in America looking at how to prevent that or deal with it, minimize it. But what was happening was a lot of young cops were being sent to the border or sent into really tough areas, West Belfast, Londonderry, Crossmaglen, South Armagh, working with the army, jumping in and out of helicopters, being away from home weeks at a time, lying in ditches, doing searches, kicking in doors. And after 2 or 3 years, you know, they almost became like soldiers. They had a great mentality, great team spirit, good at certain things, but weren't ordinary cops. Then they've done their 3 years and they're sent to some leafy suburb in Belfast and asked to be able to deal with shoplifting and deal with a little prang someone's Mercedes has been scraped in the car park. And they're being told off for not having those skills when previously they were doing what they thought was heroic work and being recognised by military colleagues and police commanders. So a lot of those young guys, they killed themselves. The average age of police suicide was 21. And, you know, without going into it too deeply, there's a well-known psychological aspect called anomie, where you lose sense of purpose, where you lose a sense of group and identity and support. And I've no doubt that that was one of the things, while we thought, and this is why I thank God I was 23 when I joined, because I didn't have any of that stuff. If you're an 18 or 19-year-old young police officer who's afraid to show that you're frightened, so therefore you maybe overreact and to be the tough guy, and then suddenly you're exposed later that you can't even do a road traffic accident, but you're brilliant with a machine gun or jumping in and out of a helicopter or all the military skills, they just lost their way. And alcohol and the availability of a gun certainly didn't help things, you know. But that's maybe going into the topic for another day.
Actually, speaking of 1981, that was the year, I believe. Sorry, it was 1980. But John Weir, who himself was an RUC officer, he was convicted. Then he was obviously, if anyone knows about him, he was working with a loose group called the Glennon Gang, including Robin Jackson, who we mentioned. When that conviction did happen, you were, I think, about 2 or 3 years into the job. What did it cause like shockwaves within the RUC? Was it like the talk of the town, so to speak, given that such a heinous thing was going on with one of your members? It was like very, very. It's probably the best evidence of collusion, you know.
Well, it's funny because even today, there are reverberations of the Glenanne gang. And, you know, I have a position, as you probably know. I'm the chairman appointed by the Department of Justice of an organisation called the Royal Ulster Constabulary GC Foundation. That is an organisation which gets very small funding, but we're there to mark the sacrifices and honour the achievements of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. And we do that in all sorts of ways, with church services, memorials, marches, bursary schemes to support current policing and so on, lectures, we have partnerships with universities and so on. I hope it doesn't surprise you or anybody else that I would never say that the RUC was perfect or look at the RUC through rose-tinted glasses. There were people who were absolute rogues, as there is in every organisation, whether it be the church, education, anything else, who should never have been in the organisation. But somehow or other they got in, besmirched the name of others. So those guys, I was probably too young. I was just married. I was probably my first child had been born. I was dealing with all the stuff that you deal with in the early part of your career, working 12, 16-hour shifts, coming home, sitting up in the early hours of the night, studying for your sergeant exam, going away to England for a year to the police college to come back as a sergeant. And, so I was very career minded. I have to be honest, when I look back at myself, I must have been extremely energetic, extremely focused. It was the chosen vocation. I gave it everything. Those guys that you've talked about, the Jackal, Robin the Jackal, or the John Weir, I think there was another horrendous one involved in a murder up in the border of another colleague. And there's also a police officer convicted of murder after he had left the police. Somehow he had inveigled himself. And so there are 3 or 4. And there was another guy I think was involved in fraud, using the police computer for his own profit, buying and selling cars. Those guys would have been so, in a sense, unusual that they weren't really registering on my. It was just, thank God somebody's caught those guys. And it would have been the RUC caught them. And that's the thing, we didn't have an ombudsman, we didn't have internal affairs in the way that it works now with independent bodies. You had the complaints and discipline branch. So the hardest, in my opinion, the people that were hardest on bad cops were other cops. And because I was a career man and always in the forefront of defending the police and so on, whether it be in the media or lecturing or whatever, I will never deny that there were people who should never have been in the police, people who, destroyed the police reputation and gave ammunition to those that made us think that we're all thugs, or we're all anti-Catholic, or we're all involved in collusion, which to me is a nonsense. The vast, vast majority of us are just ordinary men and women put into extraordinary situations where, sadly, yes, we come from one part of the community or the other. And that's why I was very involved, the more I went up the ranks, in trying to make sure that women and Catholic officers were treated as best we could, because those that denied that there was any misogyny or any sectarianism or whatever, they're fooling themselves. The RUC was like any other organization. It's one I am so proud to be part of, still so proud to remember. But it had to learn, it had to improve. What the RUC was like in my dad's time was very different from what it was like in my time. And it was very different from what it was like when I joined to what it was like when I left. And now I have a son serving, and there's no doubt the policing in Northern Ireland is very different in his time. Whether it's the use of mobile cameras, the fact that they have body-worn cameras, the fact that they have more scientific breakthroughs like DNA, the fact that they can actually go and hold a scene for 3 days if there's a murder, instead of, in our case, you've got 10 minutes to get out, or else you're going to be shot yourself. So I'm rattling on a little bit, but to answer your question, those rogues who have been proven to be outliers or renegades, or betrayed everything that a police officer and a police service should do, whilst we had no time for them, it was just seen as almost they were there, but they were so of so little consequence. I don't mean to the people that they murdered or to the people that they betrayed or to the services, but for the ordinary working cop as a constable or a sergeant, just say, oh, thank God they've been caught, thank God they've been got rid of, or they've been prosecuted. We move on.
Okay, we'll get to it, but obviously you became like a managing officer, kind of a commanding type of officer later on. Did anyone under your command ever get accused of passing information or colluding in some way, or did you ever have to investigate a claim, whether it ended up being true or not?
No.
Never.
Never. And that's why, if the interview is going to go down a certain route about collusion, one thing or another, I might be not the best interviewee, in the sense that, it is going to be a very straightforward black and white answer. There's no officer that I've ever been in charge of or worked with that, to my knowledge, was either investigated or suspected in relation to collusion or unprofessional behavior that could have been seen as either sectarian or any way. what was a regular complaint for most police officers, including myself, was use of force, and that sadly, for some people, was almost like a badge of honor, and others as, you know, oh my goodness, I don't want to get involved in this. So there were those of us who were not afraid to, whether it was kick the doors down or drag the people out or go straight into the fisticuffs and make arrests, and others who would be maybe a little bit more reticent in case a complaint would damage their career. I always believe that, you know, if you're leading from the front and you're doing your best, you've got the law on your side, as long as you're using legitimate force, it's proportionate, it's justified, it's properly recorded. I've known 5 officers who've taken life, all been investigated. One was outside this country, but I was a sergeant when he was a police sniper in another country, and 4 who took lives in Northern Ireland, all investigated, all vindicated, and all 5 say it has, if not ruined their lives, certainly they find it very difficult. One in particular can't sleep at night, when he was actually ordered to take the life of someone who was in the process of stabbing a wife in a domestic situation. He was a police sniper and was given the order to take life. So again, I try to make a distinction. Most police officers, despite the fact that we're trained to take life, and we're not only permitted to, we're required to take life if it means protecting someone else's life. I mean, I wouldn't have any choice. If someone was coming in now to slit your throat and I had a gun and didn't save your life by taking your life, I'd be failing in my duty. You know, so most cops take life or the use of force pretty seriously. But there was a period, certainly in my career, in the late 70s and all through the 80s, right up to Drumcree, when I was, you know, an assistant chief constable in the 2000s, ordering the use of batons, plastic batons, water cannon, and so on. As long as you're doing it legally, and as long as you're doing it properly, and as long as you're recording the decisions and the rationale for the decisions, you have nothing to fear. But that's not to say that we didn't get it wrong on some occasions. But no, I can honestly say, and I stand to be corrected if anybody can tell me anything otherwise, I can't think of any officer who was ever under any suspicion at all in my command or in any area I worked that was involved in collusion.
I see. Obviously, it was a different time, and it wasn't just the RUC. It was kind of police and army around the world, but it was way rougher. Like you alluded to, you were only 15, and a bunch of fully grown cops gave you an absolute hiding in an alleyway. Now, that wasn't someone who was getting interrogated, who's a suspected terrorist. So I'd have to imagine that back then, some of the things that went on in interrogation rooms would make you shudder, probably, would it?
Yeah, I have no doubt. But again, that is about society as well. I mean, I would never excuse bad police behaviour, but I do believe in context. As a kid, I saved up some money and did a sort of hitchhiking Greyhound bus tour all around America, bummed around, slept on the buses, slept at bus stations. And I remember a cop attacking me in Los Angeles because I had my feet up on another seat in a bus station in LA because he thought I was some sort of bum. You know, just took a nightstick and whacked me. And, you know, what do you do? Do I make a complaint and the officer gets dismissed? It'd been a nonsense. In those days, things were different. If that was recorded now, of course, it would be tantamount to, you know, a sackable offence, and depending on my ethnicity, a racial issue or whatever, you know. But you know, cops were pretty crude, and in some countries that I have worked in recently, policing is still very crude. I mean, I would say you probably have the most sophisticated model of policing in the world in Northern Ireland, the most accountable, the most overseen, the most reformed. I mean, you could argue, I would say that, of course, but there's a reason for it. And this is where some of the contention does come into the issue. It's very hard for cops to think that after all the loss of life, after all the courage, after the impact on individuals, whether it be suicide, marital breakup, alcoholism, mental health issues, something, that somehow the cops are being blamed as the bad guys in the troubles. When there were paramilitary groups, as I say, they were killing each other, torturing each other, wrecking their own communities, ratting out on each other. You know, I mean, they were infiltrated with informants and touts of the most horrible type of people you'd want to meet, you know, sex criminals and anything. And if the police in those days were able to use something to maybe get someone to save someone else's life, it's very hard not to justify that. Easy to sit in an office, easy to read a report and see that differently. And here's the thing that I like to tell people about. As you may know, I volunteered to go to Iraq in 2003. Immediately after Saddam Hussein was removed, they wanted a police officer of senior rank. So I was the most senior British police officer to serve in southern Iraq. And I mentored a man with over 2,500 tribesmen, a man called Abu Rashid, who was in the Marsh Arabs. And I got him and his men uniform and AK-47s and some money. And they were brought into the police. Better to have them in the tent than out. They were right on the Iranian border. And I got the Americans to agree that we would turn them into some sort of local police department. The guy himself was shot dead a few weeks after I'd been working with him. 2 gunmen fired from 2 different locations as he came out of the mosque on a Friday morning. So the army flew me up. I was a deputy chief constable. I went in a little army Gazelle helicopter, jumped into an open snatch vehicle, went to the scene. His body had been taken away. There was blood in the street. There should have been, under normal circumstances, house-to-house inquiries, empty cases discovered, firing points established, all the evidence gathered, blah, blah, blah. Within 10 minutes, the army were telling me, there's a tribe on the way here with RPG-7s. We're leaving. And if you're not coming with us, you're being left behind. So what do you do? Now, if I'm hauled before some court in 20 years' time and said, why did you not investigate that murder properly? Why did you not hold the scene for 5 days? Why did you not bring in scientists from all over the world to deal with that? I mean, this is a very important person who was murdered. The reality is the context was literally life and death. And when people talk about why did the RUC detectives, they only have 2 pages of notes on someone who was shot in Divis or Shankill Road or whatever, they forget that sometimes those cops were dealing with 3 or 4 murders a day. They can only get there with army patrols. And if the army patrols were leaving, they're not going to stand around in their suits with a little Walther PPK and deal with hundreds of people coming at them with petrol bombs. So everything has to be contextualized. As I say, never for 1 minute would I excuse any cop or any group of cops for doing anything that they knew was wrong. But the context is important. And more than anything, it has to be based on evidence, not conjecture, not putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 5. So yes, there have been some cases where cops have been quite rightly prosecuted. But in my experience, they are few and far between. Most of them, in my view, were literally heroic. But even turning up day after day, week after week, year after year, decade after decade as an RUC officer, to me that means something. Don't forget, military went home to their barracks after an 88-hour patrol. Cops went back home to their houses where more were murdered than on duty. You know, when you start looking at the statistics, shot driving out of their homes, blown up getting into their cars, shot picking their kids up from school, murdered in car parks visiting their child on his first day of birth, as Constable Proctor was 41 years ago. So, you know, I have nothing but gratitude for the fact that I was able to serve alongside some of those people. But again, I would be absolutely scathing against anybody who let the side down.
Sure. Speaking of letting the side down, it must be Christ above. It must be an awful thing to discover as a former RUC officer when the likes of like Mark Haddock, like information about him that he was an RUC agent while committing atrocious murders. Likewise, Ken Barrett, Ken Barrett was taken on as an RUC agent after he confessed to murdering Pat Finucane. So yeah, how does it make you feel when these things come out, as someone who regularly defends the RUC? Like,
well, I have a very, it might seem quite self-protective point of view, but the fact is, John, I chose to be a certain type of RUC officer, and by that I mean someone who was ambitious to get into a senior position, because I believe in leadership. I believe in changing from within. I chose to be a uniformed, community-based cop. So, believe it or not, I was never a detective, and I was never a member of Special Branch. That makes me quite unusual, because if you look at nearly all the other assistant chief constables, they have either at some time been involved in the investigation units or Special Branch. And that whole side of policing, in a sense, at the time, some people may have thought, oh, he's chosen the softer side, even though I was the guy who had been on TV trying to justify why we were dealing with riots or public disorder at Drumcree or Shankill Road or wherever. I always enjoyed interacting with the public, leading from the front, doing the TV bit. That whole covert side of policing, the Special Branch side, the running of informants, or CHIS as they call them now, covert human information sources. That's not something I have either expertise in or really would be a good witness. But that brings me to the point, those who were, I'm not going to name them, they can name themselves, and it's probably a matter of public record, but every single senior police officer of my rank, assistant chief constable and above, who led Special Branch, who worked with military intelligence, they're the guys that should be going front and center. I can tell you about everything I did and uniform operations and all the stuff that I did in terms of change management, developing community policing. Yes, some of it was maybe seen as soft, but some was really hard, trying to go into the hardest areas on patrol without the army, having had the blanket of security of the army, trying to engage with ex-prisoners, working on restorative justice programs, shaking hands with people who'd committed murder and to try to engage. I know what it's like to be accused of being the wrong type of cop at different times, but I don't want to disappoint you, but to be able to try to talk about how informants were handled and the whys and wherefores of it would be difficult for me. But I am like anybody else to discover that there were informants who were either permitted or not prevented from continuing to act as active paramilitaries, whether it be in torturing their own, protection rackets, and right at the top scale involved in murders. Terrible. I know there is this thing about the lesser of evils. Do you allow one life to be lost to prevent 10 others being lost? Well, all I can tell you is I swore an oath as a police officer to protect life. So I would probably be the very wrong type of person to be trying to make those decisions, because I would always believe on short-termism, prevent what you can prevent now, as opposed to let something run.
Does it interest you? I think if it was me, having been the type of cop you were, who didn't deal in Special Branch or the more murky, shadowy stuff, is there any part of you that's interested in it, like now, like if a book were to come out, let's say, on that topic exactly of RUC Special Branch, and like using the likes of Ken Barrett and Mark Haddock, would it interest you? Would it be intriguing to find out what went on in that part of the organization?
Of course, and I mean, and again, I don't want this to come out the wrong that I'm somehow distancing myself from them, because don't forget, I think it was both during Ronnie Flanagan's time and Hugh Ord's time. So the transition period of being in charge of the RUC to being in charge of PSNI, and then trying to move the PSNI into the shape that we wanted it to be, more representative, more accountable, more partnership, problem solving, and so on. I remember pointing out that we were disparate in the sense that, you know, to be a totally cohesive top team, you had me working out of a little porta cabin in Portadown in the middle of an army camp. I was a regional commander for the whole of the whole southern end of Northern Ireland. There would have been special branch officers working to me, but not reporting to me, if that makes sense. They would have been going direct to headquarters, working with the MI5s and the MI6s and the other units, and probably only the chief constable would have been aware. But you had me as the head of one region in Portadown. You had the head of crime in Knocknagunny, a part of Belfast. You had the chief constable in Garnham, in Knock. You would have had the head of personnel in another location. You would have had the ACC Belfast in another location. So we didn't even see each other. You know, we didn't have Zoom in those days or anything else. So one of my recommendations, which was taken up, was that didn't matter what time of day it was. Should it be 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock? We should meet every morning to share information. And I wanted to know what was going on. Likewise, I wanted people to know what I was up to. We settled on 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I do feel responsible for making that suggestion, just as one way in which we became a bit more cohesive. But I don't subscribe to this sort of bland title, you know, a force within a force, that there was inner circles and so on. But there was no doubt there were tight lines. So I was very aware of my job. My job was uniform policing, working with the military, trying to provide protection and prevention of both terrorism and ordinary crime in all the areas I was responsible for. But I was also very well aware that there was an intelligence side, an intelligence-led side, which I was not privy to. I mean, I make no apology for saying this. One of my jobs for 3 years was to be the staff officer to the chief constable. That was from 1993 to 1996. And when the head of special branch came in to speak to the chief constable, I had to leave the room. When an intelligence report was sent down to the chief constable, it was in 2 envelopes. I was allowed to open the first envelope and take the second one into him. And there would have been a very tight triumvirate of the Secretary of State, the GOC, the General Officer commanding the army, and the chief constable, who would have been, in a sense, that inner circle. Each one of them advised, obviously, by their own heads of intelligence. So there were very tight lines, very tight circles of command. I would never absolve myself, and I hope none of your listeners think I'm trying to absolve myself from any aspect of RUC policing. I was a proud RUC officer, but I had a particular set of roles, a particular set of skills, a particular set of responsibilities. And, you know, to go right back to your question, would I be interested to know what went on? Of course. There was that type, you know, it was a dirty war. Yeah, well, I don't want to be part of anything dirty. I can understand you need to be clever. But, you know, I always want to believe, still do believe, that the cops were the good guys. But were we, you know, so lily white that we rode into town on a white horse with a white hat, and the bad guys just picked us off? No, of course you needed people with special skills who could infiltrate, who could use technical means, surveillance, wiretapping, all that, phone bugging, and all. Of course it was important. Anything that the state can do and the police can do to prevent life being taken, I'm all for. But yes, if there were mistakes made and there were crude things that had to be improved, of course that's the lesson that needs to be learned.
Very good. Okay, so on a personal level, you must have had you've described some of them, but you've had countless days where the day at work was like incredibly traumatic, and I can only imagine how much it would take out of you. I mean, we're talking about riots, seeing seeing your fellow officers get hurt or killed, yourself nearly hurt or killed, shot at. What's it like? What's it like going home? Just going home after that and having to not having to decompress. Do you vent about it? Do you tell a compressed version and then keep the rest to yourself? How did it go?
Well, it's good. But my first marriage didn't last. My kids came with me, so I was going through the last few years of my police career with 2 teenagers in the house, which was pretty tough going. But I remember when they were young, you know, you genuinely didn't think you might get home that night. You know, people were being killed all around you, and whether it was a 12-hour shift or a 16-hour shift, I especially my daughter, she's a woman now in her 40s, but I would have picked her up out of her cot and just give her a little hug and just let her know that she means something to me, and if I don't come home tomorrow, you had a dad to be proud of. That type of thing. Likewise, my son, you know, different. Maybe with son, you're tougher, maybe with boys, but you know, I want my son and daughter to realize that their dad did come through a lot. He's a big softy now, but he wasn't then. And I think that's one of the things that happens when you get old. You allow yourself to cry. You allow yourself to get it out. In my day, it was always about fitness. I kept myself very fit. I ran marathons. I played football. I played squash. I was always of the opinion, you know, if you're the fittest one in the jungle, you're gonna survive. A lot of cops maybe drank and ate too much and all that sort of stuff. You know, the old fat donut eating cop image. I believe in fitness. I always had a faith. You know, I would still say the odd prayer. I'm not a great Bible thumper. I don't mean it like that, but I always had a faith that I was doing the right thing, and I had a faith in my colleagues that we'd pull ourselves out of a scrap. I've been in some scrapes, all right. You know, we've had to fight our way out of things, and you know, when you're caught and someone's trying to take a gun off you and you're surrounded by a crowd, there's nothing more frightening. I've been shot at 3 times, been beaten up, I've been hospitalized, I've been through a lot of trauma, you know, and you still keep bouncing back. But last week I buried a police officer, a friend, my friend's son, and the bagpipes and the guard of honor and so on, and I could see what it was taking out of the young police officers because it was so strange, whereas we were doing this all the time. And I spoke to the cops, even though I'm an old retired man now, and I said, you know, you have permission to cry. In my day, you think some IRA guy or some UVF man's watching this on TV and he's not going to see me cry, you know, stiff upper lip and all that. Now we're in a different world. I think I'm not talking about, you know, wokery and all that. But I do think mental well-being and all those things are important. And I think it's okay for a cop to show softness, not weakness, but softness. And yeah, I did go through a hell of a lot, and there's no doubt I'm a survivor. You know, I think I'm very fortunate. I've been injured a few times, and not always through police duties, but you know, I can bounce back. But I know some people have been through things and have found it very hard. You know, they've been traumatized by it. Maybe it's just the way I was brought up. I don't know, but I just think I'm one of the lucky ones. And that's why I have a soft spot for the police widows, the disabled. You know, we have guys still who've lost limbs, are still proudly wearing their RUC green blazers and medals, wanting to show people around our memorial garden and tell them the story. And I think that is, I know you've been looking at some big issues, political issues around collusion, professionalism, supervision, all those important things, strategic issues around policing. But for me, it's all about the humanity as well. Why do you get involved in the police? How can you keep yourself sane when you're dealing with child abuse and animal torture? You know, I mean, it's not easy being a cop at times. So you've got to believe you're doing the right thing. And I think training and supervision has a lot to do with it as well.
I was going to say, I mean, literally, like, cops are like when people in ordinary society don't want to deal with the particular problem when it's so bad, the cops are the one it gets left to. They're the very last kind of line. So yeah, they have to see some of the dredges the dredges of what humans can do, some of the worst behaviors.
Yeah.
I won't keep you too much longer. We obviously spoke about times when your life was endangered on the job, but you had like specific threats. You had actual assassination plots against you, given you were high up and stuff. At one stage, I heard in another interview that you even lived in the police station for like 9 months, and
Yeah.
then even in the garden, even you're at home doing a bit of gardening, you have to have your gun next to you, like.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. My life's probably idyllic now because I can walk about with a dog and not worry who's going to pull up behind me in a car or whatever, you know. Not maybe not say more in case I tempt fate. I'm sure there's still some people out there have scores to settle, but no, it wasn't easy. I moved into. I was a young chief inspector. I'd only been in the job about 9 years. So back in that day, you know, that would have been quite high profile, becoming a chief inspector with 9 years service, sent down to Fermanagh, working on the border. And of course, because of my background, I wanted to be out and about, out with the army, the police station. I had 3 police stations blown up in 6 months. I went out and stayed overnight with the guys and made sure that, you know, you're raising morale or doing whatever you had to do to get things back to normal. Then you go on TV and condemn the terrorist attacks or do whatever you had to do to build morale up. So things I got to notice very quickly. You know, a Belfast man of my age, my rank, pontificating on TV. So the special branch got information that I was going to be taken out. And despite the fact that I just moved my family there, bought a house there, got the kids into new schools, I was whisked out and had to live in a police station for undercover for 9 months, which was horrible, knowing that my kids were in a place where my danger was, and yet I was in a safe place. It's a bit like when I was injured back in the 80s and put into a training branch job for a while. Well, my old father was 62 and his vehicle was riddled with machine gun fire. That again is one of those things that bothered me for years, that, you know, why is he there when I should be there? I'm younger and fitter. But yes, I remember one day in my garden and a group of guys came. They were actually working for a money lending team. I think one of my neighbours, who I didn't even know, owed money, and somebody sent some heavies to deal with him, and they mistook me for him. They jumped out of the car, and I had no shirt on. I was just digging in the garden, and I remember holding the shovel up as if to fend off bullets because I was waiting for the guns to appear. But I always kept my gun in a bucket. If you're out in the garden, you know, you can't wear a holster or whatever, but I always had it near me, and you know, I slept with it under my pillow. I mean, but that was the norm, you know, false number plates, false occupation, whatever you had to do to survive. And of course, we'd be fooling ourselves too, because in Northern Ireland, it's such a small place. Everybody knows everybody, you know, and if you want to follow someone home, it's not too difficult if you want to find out where somebody works. And sadly, that's why so many cops lost their lives in soft situations. They were set up or they were let down by information being released that it shouldn't be, or whatever the case may be. So I'm not one of those people that believes in crying on parade. I think, you know, it was a privilege to do the job. I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm still around. But I just wish those who still try to demonize the police, still try to justify the activities that led to the deaths and destruction of not just police but civilians and ruined this community. Go back to what I said at the beginning. If you want to convince people that there is an alternative to a partitioned island, you can do it without killing people. You know, what's your plan? What's the attractiveness? The old nonsense about, you know, one more slog and we'll get the Brits out. It's not of this world. You know, it just doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm a cop. I believe in evidence. Show me the evidence. What would be better if Northern Ireland was back in a new Ireland, which was part of the EU or part of a new future? What would it look like? How would I be treated? How would my family be treated? Economically, politically, religiously, whatever. What's the socially, what's the advantage? Do you really think killing people is going to get you there? Not a chance.
To be fair though, I mean, yeah, I agree with you, but I think a lot of people at the time would have felt that, like, you know, Catholics and nationalists would have felt that, like, the RUC is against me, the army's against me, the government's against me, and there's things like I think it's called gerrymandering, where like voting blocks. But I think I can understand someone saying, look, the legitimate democratic type means of getting freedom as they saw it are being blocked and are being hindered. So then even if you're violent for a bit, then at least it can kind of bring the other side to the table. Would you understand that on some level?
I understand it, and if I was a teenager, I'd maybe even support it, you know. But I'm an old man now. When I look at people like Jerry Fitt and John Hume, they were the people that got it right. No disrespect to Martin McGuinness, or I don't like speaking ill of the dead, you know, but murdering people, well, how does that bring people of Ireland together? And yeah, it's okay saying that the RUC, the army, are against me. If the state, and this is where I probably have a healthy cynicism against most politicians, it's not the cops that drew up the law. It's not the cops who designed the border. You know, it's the pure old cops. Look what happened to the RIC, for goodness sake. You know, they were slaughtered and treated so badly, and yet I suspect most of them were like RUC officers, just doing the job. You know, there's something cowardly about shooting a cop who's doing traffic duty, or helping kids cross the roads, or running a youth club or whatever, a football club, as they tried to do earlier this year. How does that bring bring Ireland any more united, you know, or people together? And sadly, then people do go to the extremes, and then we do start voting for politicians who are extreme as opposed to moderate. But you know, what do I know? I'm only an old cop.
Very good. Thank you very much for all your time. I might ask you one more thing now. As someone who's very familiar with Northern Ireland during the Troubles, if there was like an area in particular where you would say like was the toughest to be a cop, even like a general area, what would you say it was?
I don't know if there was one. I mean, obviously, South Armagh, I think, had 52 casualties, 52 officers killed in a relatively small geographic area. But in terms of trying to deal on a day-to-day basis, I worked in what was the old B division, which was Springfield Road, Grosvenor Road, and you were dealing with, you know, the interfaces between the Shankill and the Falls. You were patrolling Ballymurphy, Andersonstown, everything, even I remember going to a terrible sexual crime against a woman in her 80s who had been sodomized and so on, and even trying to get help to that woman. We were getting heavily pounded, soldiers being attacked, and indeed one soldier killed. So there's some places that definitely, you know, every day was a challenge. I was also a sergeant in Tennant Street, which covered the Shankill Road, and it was a tough place. But yeah, for me, because I am a Belfast guy, it was the tough, ultra loyalist, ultra Republican parts of Belfast that personally gave me the biggest challenge, you know.
Thank you very much. Thank you for staying 90 minutes. I appreciate every minute of it. Is there anything you want to leave us with there, just as like a final thought?
Not really. I suppose that question about how did you survive or how did you cope, I do like people to know that, you know, I really do appreciate the support that I was given by many good people, whether they be within the job or outside the job. And when people say, how did you get through? I was about the, you know, the 3 F's: faith, fitness, and family. And yeah, I had a faith. As I say, wouldn't be the first time I said a little prayer going up White Rock Road, especially if someone had fired an RPG-7 the day before. And but I also had a faith in my training and a faith in my colleagues that, you know, the vast majority were good people trying to do the right thing. Family, absolutely. I'm very fortunate my family were right behind me. in many ways, the police become a family also. But then fitness, if you keep yourself fit and you look after healthy body, healthy mind, I think that's important. And a lot of people didn't get through. So all I can do is say, thank God for the experiences that I had and the fact that I've come through them. And I really hope that the current generation of police officers, both sides of the border, get the support from the decent people that they deserve, and obviously get the support when they're putting the others away, because whether it be crime gangs from outside this island, or whether it be internal terrorists or criminals or whatever, it's only the police that are going to protect the public. So give them all the support we can, and yet at the same time, the police have to be realistic. It takes real courage to give evidence in this situation.
I'm very sorry now. I just remembered one question there, if I could ask you.
Sure.
Sorry. Okay, so the other RUC officer who actually said who told me to say hello to you from him was Colin Breen. He once told me of a story where a man who was driving the exact same type of car, color, make, model as him was assassinated with the assassin thinking it was him. The only difference was in the number plate. There was like an 8 and a 3 was different. He told me then one time that when he was off duty, he was in a pub and he recognized two men who he said were very, very serious players, and they recognized him, and they sent down 2 points to him to just to know like yeah, I know who you are. Has anything like that ever happened to you? Have you bumped into anyone off duty?
Oh yeah. I mean, one particular IRA man, I arrested him 3 times. I arrested him when I was a constable, a sergeant, and an inspector. And I remember him. I'll not mention his name or say too much more, because people could work out immediately. But anyway, let's just say he didn't like me and I didn't like him. And I remember I'd just got a nice new car with a nice golden retriever in the back, and my 2 kids, and we had a day off, went to the seaside. And as we pulled into the car park, this guy pulls in behind me, and he gets out with a few heavies, and he makes a very obvious point of looking at my number plate, and how you doing, Mr. White? How are you, Mr. White? So I know your name, and I know your car. I've got the number plate. I know where you're going, and I just laugh it off and walk away. And of course, as soon as he goes around the corner, we're back into the car and away somewhere else, and you get the number plates changed and so on. I mean, those sort of things happen. I remember going to Queen's University. I did a master's degree there, and being asked to go somewhere, and I walked into the room, or I was walking up the stairs to the room to meet the lecturer on it was a 1-to-1 thing, and I just had a horrible feeling I was being set up, and the door behind me slammed, and a guy came around the corner at the top of the stairs with a bag, and I was just waiting for him to pull a machine gun out or something, and I got my gun out first, and the poor guy behind me, who had nothing to do with anything, and the poor guy in front of me had nothing to do with anything, they almost fainted, and I felt so stupid. But sometimes you just do these things. It's a reaction. You think it's either them or me, and in that occasion, it was a total false alarm. But I mean, that 2 or 3 seconds of panic, that this is it. I'm not coming home tonight, and listen, I could bore you with all sorts of stuff. I mean, it's just it happens. You can't go through a career in the police in Northern Ireland without having a few sleepless nights or a few scares.
Again, thank you again. Appreciate all your time, all your insight, everything you shared. Yeah, we've been meaning to sit down for a while, so I'm glad we finally could. Thank you.
I appreciate it, and I wish you every success. And there's nothing to be hidden from, or nothing to be scared of telling the truth. I mean, here's a quick one I'll leave you with. When I was in West Belfast, one of the fittest and fearless guys I had, I used to call him a Jack Russell, because whenever we were getting hit, say we were in an armoured vehicle driving through Ballymurphy or wherever, and we'd be hit with paint bombs, which cover the windscreen, then you can't see where you're going, and you're having to pile out to try to clean the window. Meanwhile, petrol bombs are coming in, maybe shots are being fired or whatever. This guy would always been the first one out to try to make an arrest. And like really a grown police officer with all the kit you're wearing, body armor and everything else, to try to catch a teenage kid, it's not easy. And but this guy, he was always the first one out, and he surprised me by telling me he was leaving the police. He'd bought a pub in Spain. And I said, really? His name was Phil. It's probably 40 years ago now. It's actually 39 years ago. I said, Phil, you'll be a great loss. You know, you're always the fearless. You were the Jack Russell. You'd have tackled anything. And he said to me, you know, boss, I was so afraid that you and my mates would see how afraid I was. That's why I did it.
He was overcompensating.
Yeah. So we're all kids at heart, you know. He was so afraid of being seen to be afraid that he had to act brave. And, you know, I think there's a little lesson in there that sometimes you just have, you know, when you put the shield on or you put the cap on, you just have to act out the part. And at the end of it, you know, when you take the hat off, you take the body armor off, you're just the same little kid you were to begin with. And hopefully you've learned the right things, whether it be from your mother or father or from your sergeant or whoever. But, you know, in my view, it's an honor to be a police officer, and it's those that dishonored it, shame on them. But the vast majority of our UC men and women, I'm proud to be associated with them. Okay. One of the things that I valued more than anything was hard work, decency, and going the extra mile. And I honestly believed, I think it was the military taught me this, that it's always the weakest that gets shot. So if you're on a patrol, whether you're in Vietnam or Korea, if you're seen by the enemy as the sloppy one, you know, the guy that's not switched on, he's not taking cover, he's trying to get a sneaky smoke or whatever, you're the one the sniper's going to take out. Whereas if you're the one that's, excuse my language, shit hot, you know, you're on the ball, you will survive. So I trained my sections, particularly in West Belfast, that we had to be the best. And we were driving down the Falls Road one day and cut into a street. There'd been a lot of shooting, a lot of murders at that time. And a young, cocky constable had just joined me. He was extremely good looking, extremely cocky. Was good with the women, you name it. You know, he'd put you in mind. What do you call the guy? The Irish Farrell, the actor.
Colin Farrell.
Colin Farrell, yeah. You know, that sort of, you know, tall, dark, and handsome. And he was so cocky that anyway, we're driving along the street, and I sometimes would get into the back of the Land Rover. I would sit in the front passenger side. I'd sometimes get into the back to let the constables know that I could do whatever they were doing. So whether jumping out, taking cover, doing vehicle checkpoints, blah, blah, blah. And I was in the back of the vehicle, and you can only see there's little portholes which you open up to fire through if you have to. I said, Constable, what street are we in? And he sort of cocky laughed. Ha, that's the Falls Road, Inspector. As if like, are you stupid? This is the Falls Road. I said, yes, I know we're on the Falls Road, but what is the street we're in? I said, you don't know, so you don't. I said, who lives in number 42? And he looked at me as if I was bad. I said, you don't know who lives in number 42? He's one of the most notorious IRA RPG 7 men. I said, are you telling me you've been here a couple of weeks and you don't know that? I said, if we get hit tonight and I'm lying bleeding to death and you're the only one that can get to the radio, and I die and your mates die because you don't know where we are and can't call for help, you're no good to me. And I humiliated him. And within about 2 weeks, that guy had produced a folder this thick with photographs of every street, photographs of every suspect, maps, code names, everything that you would need to survive and he went on to become quite a senior person and counter-terrorist, a uniform counter-terrorist unit, not the special branch. And he told me I was an old bastard, but that I'd learned so much and that I had saved him. Now, I love that story because other people who were there that night keep reminding me of it as well, because I've seen so many young guys go off the rails. You know, they are earning good money. There's a bit of kudos about being a cop. Women tend to be attracted to certain guy, you know, the macho cop and everything else. And some of them don't reach their full potential. That guy went on to be a brilliant cop, highly respected by his colleagues. And I'm delighted. There were 3 or 4 people that were there that night, and he himself had admitted it was because I was such a bastard to him that it made him what he is. And in his words, you saved me. And if that epitomizes anything of what I tried to do in my time, that's it. Keep me alive, keep ourselves alive, do our job, act professionally, go the extra mile, train, educate, all that sort of stuff. So that's the lesson I think is still the same message that should be told today. It's hard for me to watch the PSNI, what it went through there in the summer with the morale, the lack of collegiality or even comradeship. I think it's back on the rails a little bit better than it was, but for an old guy like me, that was tragedy to see what happened within Northern Ireland policing over the last sort of 6 months. But anyway, I thought I should leave you with that one.
No, very good story. I appreciate it. Very good. Thank you very much. Maybe we'll speak again sometime. Again,
I hope so, John, and I wish you every success in what you're doing.
Thank you very much. Thank you.